The story of monarchy in Britain for the last 1,500 years is one of a dialogue between crown and people, monarch and parliament that has shaped our social and political life to this day. But 500 years ago, that dialogue broke down. A taxpayer strike and dynastic conflict led to civil war and revolution. Politics fused with religion, first strengthening the monarchy, then bringing it to its knees. In this revolutionary period, the monarchy acquired a potent new symbol, an elaborate, outsized crown made for the Tudor dynasty. Known as the Crown Imperial, it came to represent the monarchy's inflated claims to rule church as well as state, and Scotland as well as England. But the very scale of the Crown's claims triggered an equal and opposite reaction. And within 100 years, a king was beheaded, the monarchy abolished, and the imperial crown itself was smashed and melted down. This series tells the story of how and why this happened, of the Tudors, who carried the crown of England to its peak, of the Stuarts, who united England and Scotland, but eventually mishandled both, and of the Revolution, which tried but failed to extirpate monarchy in Britain. The man who ordered the imperial crown to be made was Henry Tudor, founder of the Tudor dynasty. But Henry was a man who should never have been king at all. He seized the throne against all the odds. He was helped by his teenage mother, who became a great power broker. While his enemies, three brutal brothers, tore themselves apart through murder and betrayal. But behind the beheadings and the gore was the fundamental question of how England should be ruled. Henry thought he knew the answer, but his cure proved as bad as the disease. The story begins 5 years before Henry Tudor's birth, when a 9-year-old girl was summoned to court. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and with her fortune of £1,000 a year, she was the richest heiress in England. Even more importantly, as the direct descendant of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Margaret was of the blood royal. Her cousin, the Lancastrian King Henry VI, had decided that she should marry his own half-brother, Edmund Tudor, a man more than twice her age. It was a sordid mixture of money and power, with the technicalities fixed by a venal and accommodating church. Henry VI was weak. He'd failed in war, was incapacitated by long bouts of madness, and had fathered only a single child, thus leaving the succession dangerously in doubt. The union of Margaret and Edmund would, Henry hoped, strengthen the weakened royal family. It might even produce a future heir to the throne. When Margaret was barely 12, the earliest legally permissible age for sexual intercourse, he brought her to Wales, where they lived together as man and wife. Shortly before Margaret's 13th birthday, she became pregnant. But 6 months later, weakened by imprisonment in a Welsh feud and finished off by the plague, Edmund died on the 1st of November. And his child bride, widowed and heavily pregnant, sought refuge with her brother-in-law, here at Pembroke Castle. And it was in Pembroke Castle, in a tower chamber like this, that Margaret gave birth to the future Henry VII on the 28th of January, 1457. Actually, it was a miracle that both mother and child survived. It was the depths of winter. The plague still raged, whilst Margaret, short and slightly built, even as an adult, was not yet fully grown. Probably the birth did severe damage to her immature body because, despite 2 further marriages, Margaret was to have no more children. Yet, out of this traumatic birth, an extraordinary bond was forged between mother and son. Behind every successful man, it is said, there is a strong woman. In Henry's case, it was his mother. Margaret would need to be strong because her son was born into an England torn apart by civil war. For their family, the Lancastrians, was not the only one with a claim to the throne. Their opponents were the 3 brothers of the House of York. They had at least as good a claim to the throne, which they determined to make good by force. The resulting conflict was known as the Wars of the Roses, after the emblems of the 2 sides, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. Such emblems, known as badges, were worn not only by the followers of the 2 rival royal houses, but by all the servants of the nobility. And the more land you had, the bigger the private army of badge-wearing retainers, as they were called, you could afford. The forces of York and Lancaster and their noble allies were evenly balanced, with the result that after 15 years of fighting, the crown had changed hands twice between the Lancastrian King Henry VI and his rival Edward of York, who'd made himself Edward IV. The final showdown came at Tewksbury in Gloucestershire in May 1471. Edward, young, warlike and charismatic, and supported by both his brothers, the 18-year-old Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Clarence, who was 21, was determined to annihilate the House of Lancaster once and for all. The battle soon turned into a massacre, leaving thousands dead on the field. It was a decisive victory for York, a disaster for Lancaster. After the battle, many of the Lancastrians fled to Tewksbury Abbey, where they took refuge in the church here. Edward and his men then burst in hot pursuit. There are 2 different versions of what happened next. According to the official account, Edward behaved with exemplary decorum, pardoning the fugitives, offering up solemn thanks at the high altar for his victory. But the unofficial accounts tell a different and much more shocking story. In fact, Edward and his men had begun to slaughter the Lancastrians, and they were only saved by the intervention of a priest vested and holding the Holy Sacrament in his hands. Edward then recovered control of the situation by issuing his pardon. But already enough blood had been spilt to pollute the church and to require its solemn reconsecration. A day or 2 later, despite his promise of pardon, Edward ordered the beheading of most of the remaining Lancastrian leaders. Now, only the life of the feeble Lancastrian king, Henry VI, stood between Edward and an unchallenged grasp of the throne. On the 21st of May, Edward entered the City of London in triumph. That night, between the hours of 11 and 12 midnight, Henry VI was murdered here in the Tower of London, probably with a heavy blow to the back of the head. Only one man is named as being present in the Tower at the time: Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who, at the age of only 18, was already emerging as the most effective hatchet man of the Yorkist regime. Now, surely, the Wars of the Roses were over. No one, a Yorkist chronicler exulted, of the stock of Lancaster remained among the living who could claim the throne. But one Lancastrian claimant, however remote, did remain: Henry Tudor. 14 years had passed since Margaret had had her son. Now, the teenaged Henry was in danger of his life. Not even the massive walls of Pembroke Castle could protect the boy against the vengeful power of Edward of York, and his mother urged him to flee. He took ship at Tenby and crossed the Channel to Brittany. And there Henry was to endure a decade and a half of politically fraught exile before he would see either England or his mother again. Having annihilated his Lancastrian enemies, Edward IV of York was now king indeed. But the problem of nobles who were almost as rich and powerful as the king himself remained. And richest and most powerful of all was Edward's middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence. The man Shakespeare described as false, fleeting, perjured Clarence. The phrase is memorable, but it's misleading. It suggests that the key to his story lies in Clarence's character defects. It doesn't. It lies instead in his position. For Clarence was what Queen Elizabeth I, who would hold the same unenviable place herself, called the second person. His title, Duke of Clarence, was the one that was given in the Middle Ages to the king's second son. As such, he was endowed with vast estates and many grand castles like Tewksbury and Warwick. Here he kept what he called his court, with a state that was almost royal. And only the life of Edward himself, and in time Edward's two young sons, stood between Clarence and the royal throne itself. Some second persons were content to remain merely loyal lieutenants. Clarence wasn't one of them. To undermine his brother, Clarence started to stir up old, dangerous rumours. Rumours that cast doubts on the legality of Edward's marriage to his queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville was one of the most controversial women ever to have been Queen of England. She was beautiful, ambitious, greedy, and a widow of modest family background, on her father's side at least. Edward first met her when she petitioned him about a problem with her late husband's estate. Edward immediately propositioned her, but Elizabeth defended herself, it's said, with a knife. Edward, as seems then to have been his habit when women resisted his advances, offered her marriage. The two were married secretly at her father's house. Perhaps Edward had always intended to repudiate this clandestine marriage to an obviously unsuitable wife, but he didn't. Had the marriage turned out to be valid after all? Had Edward even fallen in love? At any rate, 6 months later, the marriage was made public and Elizabeth acknowledged as queen. By the mid-1470s, Elizabeth had presented Edward with 5 daughters and, crucially, 2 sons. Immortalised in stained glass at Canterbury Cathedral, they looked like the perfect royal family. Edward had what every king desired, an heir and a spare. The elder was called Edward, the younger Richard. History would know them as the princes in the Tower. But if their parents' marriage could be proved invalid, the princes would become bastards, and Clarence would be heir once more. So the ambitious second person revived an old rumour that his brother Edward had already been married to another woman at the time he married Elizabeth, thus making the union illegal. The rumour of a previous marriage may well have been true. Certainly, bearing in mind Edward's notorious way with women, it was plausible. That only made it the more dangerous, and by throwing his weight behind it, Clarence had tested his brother's patience once too often. Clarence was arrested and put on trial before a specially convened Parliament in January 1478. Edward had packed the Parliament with his own supporters. He was himself both judge and prosecutor, and no one dared to speak on behalf of the accused but Clarence himself. The verdict of guilty was a foregone conclusion, and on the 18th of February 1478, Clarence was executed in the Tower. The middle brother of York was gone. But the problem he represented was not. The monarchy had been further weakened by the Wars of the Roses. Much royal land had been given away to buy support from the nobles, some of whom, like Clarence himself, had threatened to become mightier than the king. Edward needed to strengthen his own position and that of the crown. To help him do it, he enlisted a surprising ally, a man who had spent 30 years working for the enemy. Sir John Fortescue had served as the Lancastrian Lord Chief Justice, had spent years in exile, and had been captured after Tewksbury. But the king had not only pardoned him, he'd placed him on his council. At first sight, it's rather surprising that Edward decided to spare Fortescue. As an enthusiastic hanging judge, Fortescue had planned the judicial murder of the young Edward and the whole Yorkist family. He'd written powerfully and learnedly against Edward's claim to the throne. But Edward set these personal grievances aside. He had work for the old man to do. Fortescue, the leading intellectual of Lancastrian England, would play an important part in the construction of a new, reformed Yorkist monarchy of England. Fortescue could be called England's first constitutional analyst, his key ideas shaped by the years of exile he'd spent in Scotland and France. For his experience of how other countries were governed led him to reflect on his own and to ask a series of fundamental questions. What was unique and valuable about the English system of government? What had gone wrong with it to breed the dreadful malaise of the Wars of the Roses? And how could the disease be cured without killing the patient? Fortescue set out the answers in this remarkable book. It's usually called The Governance of England, but its full title, as it appears in this early printed edition, is The Difference Between an Absolute and a Limited Monarchy, or, in Fortescue's own lawyer Latin, Dominium Regale and Dominium Politicum et Regale. France, Fortescue says, is the supreme exemplar of absolute monarchy, and England of limited. And the key to the difference between the two lies in the rules governing taxation. In France, the king could tax the common people at will, a system Fortescue strongly disapproved of, as it made the king rich but kept the people poor. But in England, the rule, established since at least the 13th century, was that the king could only tax with the agreement of Parliament. This certainly made the English rich, with a standard of living that was the envy of foreign visitors and the boast of patriotic Englishmen like Fortescue. But did the rules limiting taxation make the English king poor, and because he was poor, weak? Fortescue thought that they did, and that this weakness was the explanation of the Wars of the Roses. The issue was the relative imbalance of wealth and power between the king and his greatest subjects, the nobility. The king was relatively poor, whereas a handful of the nobles were extremely rich, which made them, in Fortescue's phrase, overmighty. One solution would be for the King of England to follow the path of French absolutism and impose by force taxes that Parliament wouldn't vote by consent. But such a challenge to traditional English freedom would be dangerously revolutionary. Fortescue instead proposed to strengthen the crown within the existing system of limited monarchy. The king, he said, should acquire land and rule by virtue of being the richest man in the kingdom. The execution of his brother Clarence allowed Edward to do just that by keeping Clarence's vast estates for himself. The royal revenues from land now increased rapidly, which meant that Edward didn't need to call a parliament again for the unusually long period of almost 5 years. But land, as Fortescue also understood, was about power as well as cash, and Edward took advantage of his newfound freedom to redraw the political map. He carved England up into territories, each controlled by a trusted member of his own household or family. It was all very cosy, but it depended to a dangerous extent on the force of Edward's own personality. It also loosened ties of loyalty, since it meant that those outside the charmed circle didn't care very much, one way or another, about who the king happened to be. But as long as Edward remained alive and well, none of that mattered, and for the next 5 years the king grew rich, and his Yorkist regime grew strong. It seemed that the Lancastrian Henry Tudor, still sheltering in Brittany, would live out the rest of his life in exile. But at Easter 1483, disaster struck the House of York. Edward was taken ill with a fever after going fishing on the Thames. Within 10 days, he was dead. Only Richard, youngest of the brothers, remained. He was not his brother's heir. But soon he would make his own brutal bid for power. It is spring 1483. After the unexpected death of King Edward IV, all eyes turned west, towards Ludlow in the Welsh Marches, where Edward's son, heir and namesake, Prince Edward, was being brought up. But at 12, was the boy old enough to rule in his own name? His mother thought that he was. Others thought not. And a faction emerged in favour of appointing his uncle, Richard, as protector or regent until the boy was old enough to exercise power himself. But Queen Elizabeth Woodville was determined to get her son crowned quickly, and the council agreed that the coronation should take place without delay. On the 23rd of April, Edward left Ludlow for London, his coronation and his reign. His escort, as the council had insisted, was limited to 2,000 men. It was enough to put on a fine show as the young king took possession of his kingdom. But other of the great lords were able to muster as many men or more. Unbeknown to the boy or his mother, Richard was summoning his own troops. He was heading south. Late on the night of the 30th of April, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, waiting in London for the arrival of her son, Prince Edward, received alarming news. Edward's cavalcade had been intercepted by his uncle Richard, who'd taken possession of his young nephew. Elizabeth, immediately suspicious of Richard's motives, fled that night with her younger son into the safe sanctuary of the Abbey at Westminster. Richard entered London with his nephew a few days later. The council quickly ratified Richard's role as protector. Young Edward's coronation was postponed until late in June, and he was placed in lodgings in the Tower.
What was Richard doing, and why? Hitherto, he'd had the reputation, in contrast with the flighty Clarence, for rock-solid loyalty to his brother Edward, who'd rewarded him with the government of the whole of the north of England. There he'd won golden opinions as a fine soldier and a fair judge. Nevertheless, his portrait suggests a man not entirely at ease. He's tight-lipped, and he's fiddling nervously with the rings on his fingers. He also had the tic of biting hard on his lower lip and pushing and pulling constantly his dagger in and out of its sheath. Was he repressed, paranoid, a hypocrite with an iron grip on himself? Or did he genuinely believe, in view of Edward's tangled marital history, that he, Richard, was now rightful king of England?
On the 10th of June, Richard summoned his troops to London. His bid for the crown had begun in earnest. A week later, Queen Elizabeth was compelled to give up her younger son Richard into his uncle's charge. The young prince now joined his brother in the Tower. Richard had both nephews, the first and second in line to the throne, under lock and key. And on the 25th of June, Parliament decreed that King Edward's marriage to Queen Elizabeth was invalid, and the princes bastards. Richard had succeeded where his brother Clarence had failed. He'd robbed his nephews of their right to the crown and cleared his own path to the throne. He was crowned King Richard III at Westminster on July the 6th, with the full blessing of Parliament. During those frantic weeks, the two princes had been seen less and less around the Tower. Now they seemed to have disappeared altogether.
By the late summer of 1483, everybody, including the prince's own mother, Elizabeth Woodville, took for granted that they were dead. They also took it as read that the responsibility for their deaths rested with Richard. For only Richard had the power, the opportunity, and, above all, the motive.
To this day, their exact fate remains a mystery. Writing 30 years later, Thomas More claimed that Richard ordered the Constable of the Tower to do them to death, but that he refused. Others, however, proved willing, and the two boys, More says, were smothered to death with pillows in their sleep. His brothers were dead, the princes gone, the crown was his. But apparently doing away with the rightful heirs to the throne was a step too far, and opposition to Richard was growing. Soon he would be fighting to the death for the crown that he'd taken by force. It was a plot between two powerful mothers, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, whose sons were lost, and Margaret Beaufort, whose son, Henry Tudor, was in exile, that would prove Richard's undoing and decide England's fate.
At some time in the late summer of 1483, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, still in sanctuary here in the Abbot's lodging at Westminster, received a visit from a singular Welshman, Dr. Lewis Caerleon. Dr. Caerleon was a scientific jack of all trades, mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and physician, and he was a master of all of them. The sanctuary, of course, was heavily guarded by the king's men, but Dr. Caerleon was waved through because he was the Queen's physician. He was also, not coincidentally, physician to Lady Margaret Beaufort as well. And in his doctor's bag, he carried on Lady Margaret's behalf a remarkable proposal that the Queen's eldest daughter, also called Elizabeth, should marry Margaret's son, Henry, and that York, Woodville, and Tudor should join together against the usurping Richard III. That Elizabeth accepted the proposal confirms that she was convinced that her sons were dead. That Margaret made it shows that she'd realised that Richard's murderous ambition had opened her son's path to the throne of England.
Margaret, now in her 40s, had been nursing her hopes for her exiled son, Henry Tudor, for years. Now she could put them into practice. His mother's plot underway, the 28-year-old Henry set sail from Brittany, where he'd lived in exile for 15 years, to make his bid for England's throne. On the 7th of August 1485, at Milford Haven, just a few miles from his birthplace at Pembroke Castle, Henry Tudor's army made landfall in the evening. His years of exile were at an end.
As soon as he stepped ashore, Henry knelt and, overcome with emotion after his return from a decade and a half of exile, began to recite the psalm, "Judge me, Lord, and fight my cause." Then he kissed the sand and, making the sign of the cross, called in a loud voice on his troops to follow him in the name of God and St. George. It was a magnificent beginning for a would-be King of England. But only 400 of Henry's men were English. Instead, most of the rest of his little army of 2,000 or 3,000 were French, and they'd come in French ships with the aid of French money and the blessing of the French king. Indeed, most of Henry's own ideas about kingship were probably French as well. So just what kind of King of England would he be, assuming, that is, that he was able to wrench the crown from Richard's powerful grasp?
The two sides came face to face at Bosworth in the Midlands, where the fate of England's monarchy would be decided.
The battle began when the vanguard of Richard's army, thinking to overwhelm Henry's much smaller force, charged down the hill here. But instead of breaking and running, Henry's front line smartly reformed themselves into a dense, wedge-shaped formation. Against this, the attack crumbled. Richard, high up there on Ambion Hill, now caught sight of Henry with only a small detachment of troops at the rear of his army. With courage or desperation, Richard decided that the battle would be settled by single combat. Richard with Henry, wearing his battle crown, with a light robe with the royal arms over his armour, Richard led a charge of his heavily armed household knights down the hill. With magnificent courage, Richard cut down Henry's standard-bearer and came within an inch of Henry himself. But once again, Henry's foot soldiers proved capable of assuming an effective defensive position, and Richard, isolated, was unhorsed, run through by an unknown Welsh pikeman, mutilated and stripped.
The third and last of the brothers of the House of York was dead. By his reckless ambition, Richard had split the Yorkist party and handed victory and the crown to Henry Tudor. Henry was crowned Henry VII 2 months later, promising to restore the glory days of his namesake, King Henry V. The symbolic union of York and Lancaster was made flesh in January 1486, when Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York, just as their respective mothers had planned. A new iconography was created, merging the two once warring roses into one, the Tudor rose. But 2 years after the wedding, Henry ordered a new, ostentatious crown to be made, one that hinted at political ambitions that went well beyond Fortescue's limited monarchy.
The crown was soon known as the Crown Imperial. Its unusual size, weight and splendour symbolised the recovery of the monarchy from the degradation of the Wars of the Roses, while the French fleur-de-lis, alternating with the traditional English cross round the band of the crown, looked back nostalgically to England's lost conquests in France. But might there be more to it than that? Henry had witnessed at first hand the powers of the absolute monarchy in France, and, some said, he liked what he'd seen. Might the imperial crown be the means by which these ideas, as Fortescue had feared, could be smuggled back into England?
At Winchester in 1486, it seemed that the new Tudor dynasty had set the seal on its triumphant beginnings. The Queen had borne King Henry VII a son and heir. He was named Arthur, and his christening at Winchester Cathedral was designed to signal the start of a new Arthurian age. The baby's godmother was the Yorkist Dowager Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, whose kinsmen also played their part. King Henry had, it seemed, ushered in a new age of reconciliation, but it was to be short-lived. Just a few months after the christening, Elizabeth Woodville was stripped of her lands and sent to a nunnery, effectively banishing her from court forever.
What had happened? It was, almost certainly, because there were too many Queen Mothers and would-be Queen Mothers around. For Elizabeth Woodville, in her moment of restored glory, had reckoned without her sometime fellow conspirator, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Henry VII had already honoured Lady Margaret with the title of My Lady the King's Mother. But since she hadn't actually been crowned Queen, she had to defer to Elizabeth Woodville, who had, and Lady Margaret didn't like that one little bit. So Elizabeth Woodville, Margaret decided, had to go. Indeed, Margaret gave precedence, only reluctantly, to Queen Elizabeth of York herself. She wore the same robes, signed herself Margaret R, and walked only half a pace behind the Queen. Lady Margaret, in short, was proving to be the mother-in-law from hell.
Margaret's behaviour was a political disaster. She was the heiress of the House of Lancaster. The humiliated Elizabeth was of the House of York, and the Yorkist nobility felt spurned too. Henry's dream of reconciliation was fading, and within a year he faced a major uprising by rebellious Yorkists, which he only narrowly beat off. But in 1491, foreign affairs intervened. The French invaded Brittany, where Henry had spent his exile. Hoping to strengthen his position at home through victory abroad, Henry followed the traditional path of declaring war on France.
The result was a curiously half-hearted affair. A reluctant Parliament made part of its grant conditional on the duration of the war, whilst Henry himself delayed setting sail for France until almost the end of the campaigning season in October 1492. 3 weeks later, the French offered terms, and on the 3rd of November, Henry agreed to withdraw in return for an annual payment of £12,500. The English soothed their injured pride by calling the payment a tribute, but the world knew better. Once, the English armies had aroused terror throughout France. Now, they were a mere nuisance to be got rid of by the payment of an easily affordable bribe.
It was a sharp lesson for Henry. England's limited monarchy couldn't match the financial and military might of French absolutism. Now he'd failed to achieve glory in war and failed to unite York and Lancaster. There was nothing left but to lower his sights and return to the financial methods previously advocated by Fortescue and implemented by Edward IV. But he did so with a novel degree of personal involvement, as each surviving account book of the Treasurer of the Chamber shows.
Henry has checked every single entry in it, and to confirm the fact, he's put his initials, HR, known as the sign manual, alongside. Indeed, he had to make the sign manual so often that he changes his style of handwriting from this rigid grid here of laborious separate strokes to a much more fast, fluid, cursive hand here.
It was privatised government, medieval style, with England run as the king's personal landed estate. It would make Henry rich, but would it make him secure? Events showed not. In 1497, he faced another rebellion. This one nearly cost him his throne. The uprising was fronted by a ghost from the past, a man claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower, returned from exile to claim his crown. He was a fraud, a Fleming called Perkin Warbeck, but he had powerful backers, the Scots, who threatened to invade England. A reluctant Parliament granted a substantial tax to the king of £120,000, and the royal army began to move north. But the tax sparked rebellion in Cornwall. The rebels could see no reason why they should pay to fight the 400-mile distant Scots. And with the south empty of troops, a rebel Cornish army marched unopposed across the breadth of England.
As the Cornish rebels approached dangerously near London, Queen Elizabeth of York collected her beloved second son, Prince Henry, from Eltham and took refuge with the boy in the Tower. It was a close-run thing. If his father were to be defeated, Prince Henry would share the fate of his Yorkist cousins, the princes in the Tower, and be done to death in the grim fortress. Instead, on the 17th of June, 1497, Henry VII defeated the Cornish rebels at Blackheath, and on the 5th of October, Perkin Warbeck himself was captured, as the Treasurer of the Chamber's account book notes exultantly. But Henry VII had learned his lesson. In the remaining dozen years of his reign, he would summon only a single brief parliament, and he would impose no more direct parliamentary taxation.
Without Parliament, contact between king and people was weakened, and the narrowing of government was further intensified by a series of personal tragedies. In 1502, Arthur, Henry's son and heir, died, perhaps of tuberculosis, aged 15. Worse was to come. A year later, Henry's much-loved wife, Elizabeth, died in childbirth. She She was only 37, and her funeral saw an outpouring of public grief.
Most grief-stricken of all was Henry VII himself, and the deaths in quick succession of his son and his wife changed him greatly. His character became harder, his style of government more authoritarian.
The sole purpose of Henry's kingship became to make him rich. Racking up rents on royal lands was no longer enough. Instead, in direct defiance of Magna Carta, he resorted to selling justice, turning fines on the nobility for running private armies into a method of revenue raising. He'd ceased to be a king and become, so his disgruntled subjects thought, a money-grubbing miser. He'd crushed his overmighty subjects, avoided the trap of weak kingship, but along the way he'd become a tyrant, a kind of absolute monarch.
Was Sir John Fortescue, seen here in effigy on his fine tomb in Ebrington Church, turning in the grave where he'd rested for the last 30 years since his death in 1479. For Fortescue believed passionately that a monarchy richly endowed with land would be a guarantor of English freedom and property right. But it hadn't quite turned out like that. Henry had acquired the land and the money, getting his hands on more of both than any king since the Norman conquest. What he hadn't delivered on, however, were Fortescue's twin ideals of freedom and property. Instead, by the end of his reign, they both seemed as dead and buried as the old Chief Justice himself.
Henry died on the 21st of April, 1509. He'd reigned for almost 24 years.
Henry was buried here next to his beloved wife in this magnificent lady chapel he commissioned at Westminster Abbey. A few feet away would soon lie the other significant woman in his life, but for whom he might never have been king, his mother. Henry died in his bed, and he died rich. But if the last 40 years had proved anything at all, it was that traditional English limited monarchy had, in the age of continental absolutism and increasingly professional armies, ceased to work. Henry's successor would give it one last try, and then, to his surprise and everyone else's, he would create a new, revolutionary imperial monarchy. This successor was Henry's second son and namesake, and, reigning as King Henry VIII, he would change the face of England forever.